Hello and welcome to our second ERG Prospective student live stream here on YouTube. Very good to see that many of you are joining us live here, and then for anyone who's watching the recording later on, welcome as well. Before I introduce our two guests today, I just want to also give a reminder that we have more of these live streams coming up. In particular, we will have another live stream in 2 weeks on October 15th, same time as today, so 3:30 p.m. Pacific time. And for that live stream, we will have Duncan Calloway, Isha Ray, and Lara Kippers as our guests here on the live stream. I just want to say one other thing. We got a lot of fantastic questions via the Google form submitted. And some of those are logistic questions that I'm not going to bring up today because that is much more a question for Candace or Kay and myself, and not so much for the other faculty here in ERG. So while we will not answer them today, we are keeping track of them, and then either we will respond individually, or we're actually also exploring right now whether we should do another session that is more on the logistics of an application later on, depending on how many more of those types of questions we get. So I think that is all I wanted to say in terms of introductions. One final thing, I promise we will not run as long today as we did last time. That was way too long, so we will definitely keep this a little bit shorter. And with that, I want to introduce my two guests that we have today. The first one is Meg Mills-Novoa. She is a professor here in the Energy and Resources Group, and also with a joint appointment in another department here in RCNR. And then our second guest is Dan Kammen. He's a professor here also in ERG. And then he has joint appointments all over the campus, I think Goldman Public Policy School and Nuclear Engineering. And if I missed some, then he will correct me, I'm sure. So welcome both, Meg and Dan. Great to have you here. So the structure of this will be that I have prepared a couple of topics that I want to ask you about, and then I will ask you about those, and then in between these topics we will take a look at the chat and the questions that came in beforehand, and try to answer as many of those as we can. All right. So I think I'm actually going, and I want to sort of mention one other thing that's actually really neat. Today, because we have today the two faculty on here that have spent the most and the shortest time at ERG. So Meg just joined us this September, and I don't know when Dan joined ERG, but he's the longest serving ERG active faculty right now. So
23 years ago.
23 years ago. He's still 37, as you can clearly tell. But that's sort of nice that we have this sort of the two ends of that story here. All right. So my first question is, I just wanted you both to just talk a little bit about what your primary research is on. What are you working on? What are the research questions that you're working on here at ERG? And why don't we start with you, Meg?
Thanks, David. It's so great to be here and interact with all of you online. So my work is really looking at the impacts of different climate change solutions on equity. And so we do that in a number of ways. One of the key projects that I've been working on for a number of years and we're continuing to work on is what happens after climate change adaptation projects end. So what is the long-term impact of these projects? What is its afterlife? How does it continue to serve communities? And I ask these questions particularly in the context of the Andes, where I work in collaboration with communities who participate in adaptation projects to understand how those projects function over time or don't, and how we can improve their design. Another project is looking at deforestation as a major driver of greenhouse gas emissions in South America, and we're doing a predictive land use modeling project that brings together quantitative and qualitative methods to really think about how we can improve our understanding of both proposed drivers and solutions of deforestation in the Amazon, and particularly looking at 3 protected areas in Brazil, Bolivia, and also Peru. And then it's really fun to be a new faculty because you have the space to sort of get excited about new ideas and build a research program. And so one of the new projects that we're getting off the ground this summer with a collaborator of mine at Boise State is working here in California and also in Nevada in the Great Basin region to look at the rural-urban connections around adaptation. So thinking about things like rural to urban water transfers, lithium mining, solar arrays. And so we're working with a great forum of stakeholders across the Great Basin this summer, where we'll be developing some of our key research questions and getting that project off the ground this next year. So it's an exciting time, and I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you so much, Meg. That all sounds very exciting. I have one follow-up question right away for you, and that is, I mentioned in our last stream that, because last week we got a question about equity and climate change, and whether Berkeley would be a good place to work on that. And I, of course, immediately talked about the cluster, so that Berkeley actually hired a whole group of people for this topic. And you, of course, are one of the members of that cluster hire. And I was just wondering whether you want to say one or two sentences about how that has played out so far for you.
Great. And I should also mention that Dan has been instrumental in that cluster hire and in what it's evolving to be. So I think he'll have great comments here too. But yeah, I was brought in as part of the climate equity and environmental justice cluster hire. And so that's me and 4 other faculty that were hired last year across the college. And so we're getting to know one another. There's an engineer, someone in sociology, there's folks in urban planning, as well as in landscape architecture. All of us are asking questions around equity and climate change, but from different disciplinary perspectives, different regional emphasis. So many of us work across the Americas. And so right now we're in this really exciting building phase where we're getting to know each other and other people across campus and starting to think about what are some larger collaborative projects that we can hopefully work on together or support each other in, both in the short term and also looking medium and long term. So it's a really exciting time to be on campus and to be asking questions around equity and climate change.
Great. That's fantastic. We've got one comment here in our YouTube chat that I'm going to show up here. It's not a question, but someone said that what you described is an amazing project, someone from Bogota, Colombia. So that I just wanted to show that.
Thanks, Laura.
And I think with that, let's move on to Dan. Dan, do you want to give us, I don't even know whether that's possible, a short overview of all the topics that you work on?
Well, I think that I get to work on a lot of topics for the same reason that Meg said, and that is the students here are amazing and risk takers and interested in changing and pushing boundaries in a lot of ways. So I'm a physicist. I did not think I was going to be an academic. I actually had a different career path picked out to be an astronaut, but I failed the vision test in Houston. And so here I am. And I got into decarbonization, clean energy, whatever you want to call it, through the lens of thermodynamics and material science and very physics, quant type of things. And I still build a lot of relatively complex power sector models and off-grid models of energy at the village level, energy within the household level, in field sites that for me have always included East Africa. And for different periods of time, they included Central America. I actually got my start in international energy work in Nicaragua, working for the Sandinista government when the US was blockading them, until a US semi-puppet regime kicked out all of us friends of the Sandinistas, and I went to East Africa. But I've also worked with Native American communities quite extensively, the Dine, the Navajo in particular, and then a whole group of underserved communities across East Africa, in Central African Republic, in the Congo, in South Sudan, kind of challenging locations. And then in the most challenging locations is actually the places where the least bit of this is all clear, and that is in what we often call the halls of power. So in Washington, D.C., in London, in Geneva, in The Hague, and places where I kind of try to bring this back of the envelope computational physics nerdy lifestyle. David wouldn't let me wear my Spock ears to this particular session. And so I try to play this kind of back and forth between what we can learn from doing the analytics and the social justice. And 20 years ago, we had a huge amount of need on that physical science side. We had to get better quality solar panels. We had to get better material science issues for batteries, energy efficiency, geothermal power. Worked on a lot of those things, and about a half my lab is still devoted to that today. But increasingly, I am sort of someone who is learning and worshiping at the feet of people like Meg, who think about the social science, the dynamics first. And so as a physicist, I'm learning about these areas in both my academic roles and the place where I try to facilitate my students. I've worked at the World Bank as the head of renewable energy. I worked for President Obama and Secretary of State Kerry as a science envoy. I'm working very closely right now with the federal government, but also with the UN, UNDP, UNEP, the alphabet soup of agencies, UN High Commission on Human Rights, in terms of how do we accelerate decarbonization for the most marginal people on the planet? And that's really what ties together my lab. People's projects are very diverse, but we try to, I would say, do the good trouble, and we try to bring the science to the good trouble that one can cause to make change. I have a big lab team that works in China with some of the biggest companies in the world on electrification of vehicles, on clean energy. And I think that sort of expansive story is more coherent than it might seem. So what it means is that students who come into my group called RAIL, the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory, tend to have a lot in common, even if one is working for the Hopi Nation, the Native American or First Peoples, and another is working with a UN agency on advanced materials for sustainable fusion power or for transparent solar. And so that's kind of the expanse that I really enjoy and feel fulfilled working on at ERG. And I couldn't do it without the amazing ERGies.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dan. I think one thing that I can sort of, from my experience, say is that there are a lot of ERG faculty that work with policymakers and work in different places, but I think no one works in so many places and with so many policymakers as Dan does, so that you definitely hold the record there, I think. Let's just see what questions we have here. We have actually a couple of I'm just going to show these. We have a couple of folks here, someone from East Africa who likes the off-grid technologies that you had. Someone from Nigeria is here. And then I have one question specifically for Dan that we can sort of maybe tackle next. And before I show that, I actually want to encourage everyone, do ask specific questions of faculty of Meg and Dan in the chat. This is your best chance to do that and actually get a really expansive response. So don't be shy. So we got one question here. This one actually came in via the Google form before the show. The question is, hi, Professor Dan Kammen. I'm from Indonesia. Have you ever done a research about renewable energy system in Indonesia? What is your thought about renewable energy, especially in developing nations?
Well, the second part of that's pretty hard because that's a very, very heterogeneous world. But I have worked extensively in Indonesia. My brother is actually a professor at the National University of Singapore who studies political science of strikes and social movements in Indonesia. And I got some of my early project experience working in Kalimantan, the Indonesian part of Borneo, where we looked at sustainable and unsustainable practices in terms of forestry and in terms of community scale energy. And today I'm very involved on the Malaysian part of Borneo, working in Sabah and Sarawak on alternatives to mega projects. Instead of flooding great swaths of the Borneo rainforest on the Sarawak side, or in Sabah on a coal plant that we were able to defeat, even after the Sabah government had partially paid for it from China. I'm quite proud that we were able to get that off the table in favor of a suite of clean energy projects. And we started in a way very much like I answered. It really started out with a technical power systems, flow of electrons analysis in the grid, but it expanded quite quickly to look at biodiversity and cultural preservation of some of the endangered indigenous Iban communities in areas that were going to be flooded by various mega dam projects. And while you never feel like you win, you feel like you pause these projects And the price or the opportunity you pay is then continued vigilance thereafter, because bad projects are like ugly forest fires. You stamp them out and they seem to reappear somewhere else. And that's why we always work very much the way Meg described. We work with a consortium of non-governmental groups, so-called NGOs. So in Sabah, we work with a group called LEAP Spiral. That's Land, Empowerment, Animals, People, in no particular order except for the acronym. But we've taken this all the way to the Asian Development Bank. We've taken it to the World Court. We've done our technical analysis, but then really tried to support indigenous communities in their projects. And one of the real wonderful benefits is that we then get a flow of PhD students coming back. So that Indonesian PhD students, a close friend. We go to a wonderful bar in Jakarta called Hot Gossip, where you can always meet someone working on some of the latest topics. And for the people who called in from Kenya and Nigeria, we've worked extensively in each area. My wife is actually Yoruba from Western Nigeria, or the North, as it's sometimes called, although it's really the West. And then some of these really difficult places where we are trying to use clean energy as a wedge against conflict. And so we have a set of students right now working in the Congo, working in South Sudan, around how can clean energy be a way to tamp down the pressures that warlords and others can foist on communities, often women-led communities, because they're so beholden to warlords for fossil fuels. Whereas clean energy, in a sense that David, as the economist, won't like, they're in some sense a non-rival good. But I'm going to leave that as a only partially accurate economic version of the story. But these are places where we feel like the benefits of clean energy really shine, pun intended. And we do try to seek out these areas where we feel like we can really leverage many of the clean energy benefits. Okay, great.
And given that I'm only the moderator today, I will not take this bait and just move on. I think the next broad question that I wanted to ask both of you is whether you can talk a little bit about opportunities for both master students and PhD students to work with you, and how you imagine that might work out in the future. Just sort of talk a little bit about, for prospective students that might be interested in particular working with you, what would that look like? In practice? And I think we'll start with Meg again.
Great. Yeah. As I mentioned, I think one of the great things about being a junior faculty and working with junior faculty who are just starting is that we're in these great building phases where we're really excited about having students, about building an intellectual community among our students. And so in terms of the way that students work with me, I've had and mentored master students who have worked directly with me in the field, in Ecuador, in Peru, and have gone on to do really great things. Some of those students are now working for the German Development Agency, GIZ. Some have gone on to do their PhD. So there's spaces for students to work directly on my projects with me, and particularly in sort of a mentorship role as they're exploring ideas and methodologies. There's also, I think, space for co-authorship and also thinking through kind of new conceptual ideas and comparative case studies, and trying to bring all the different and diverse interests of ERG students together with my interests and thinking about what that says about broader processes across bigger scales. And then I also think, right now I am recruiting PhD students, and I'm really excited to get to know students and all of their diverse interests and how their interests can sort of build and synergize and catalyze new directions. And so, there's a lot of different space for different types of students who are interested in working directly on the projects I'm already have in process, and also a lot of space and excitement for students doing different things.
Great, yeah. And I just want to, I remember when I started in ERG in 2014, and I just want to stress this first point that Meg made, which is so important. When you arrive as a new faculty in a new department, the first PhD student that you get, if you're that person, you will get a lot of attention because you're the only one, right, at that stage. And so that is actually a rare opportunity, I think, for students. All right, so maybe we'll move on to Dan. Do you want to talk a little bit about opportunities for both master and PhD students to work with you?
Sure. So in Rail, I really don't see much difference between a master's and PhD student. Our projects are almost always have a technical component and then these kind of broader social, racial, gender justice elements as well. And so it really takes all kinds of different backgrounds. I have people who come out of backgrounds very much like mine in the physics and physical sciences world. People also who did like undergraduate degrees in peace studies and rhetoric, who wanted to learn some of these technical tools while in the master's or PhD program. And so both, there's no typical ERG. All ERGs are unique in their own way. But what I find is that students who are flexible, and even if they have written overly detailed plans for what they want to do in grad school, I kind of ascribe to the Mike Tyson rule, and that is that no encounter survives a punch in the nose. And whether that punch in the nose is you took some course and it shook you up, or you had a really interesting encounter in the field or in a laboratory setting, people really change their minds. And so I encourage people to think through what they exactly want to do at ERG, and to overthink through what are the areas that they're not strong in, that they want to get strong in, whether they're coming for the master's or PhD. And so Rail is often a place where students are going somewhere intellectually or in terms of broadening careers in ways that you just can't do in many traditional departments. And that's probably the thing that I love most about ERG. The other feature is that we get asked just nonstop to get involved in things that I never would have thought. Recently, we got asked by the United Nations to get involved in an effort thinking about what are the biodiversity and cultural diversity questions around deep seabed mining, which is opening up. It's not something I ever thought about, but as we look for more materials for the clean energy transition, suddenly this is a new topic, and new topic for me. And so I love new topics, especially when I find that there's kind of an element of that science that I want to explore in them on the way to these kind of social outcomes. So this is something which is often called use-inspired basic research, or in the words of the dean that hired me when I started my faculty job before Berkeley at Princeton, and that is something called Pasture's Quadrant. And that really kind of typifies just something which I really enjoy doing, and a lot of our visitors to ERG from overseas, from other places, departments, parts of government, non-governmental groups, really like to jump in.
Okay, great. So I'm looking at our chat. We're getting a lot of questions. So I would suggest that we try to just respond really briefly to them so that we can get through many of them. I think
that was aimed at me.
I would never do that to you, Dan. So the first one here, I think, is one for you, Dan. Will you continue to research projects related to developing countries such as China?
Yes.
That is wonderful, Dan. Have you ever worked in West Africa? What are your thoughts on the possibilities of having renewable energy for the grid in Nigeria?
It just so happens that I have a current student who is Nigerian, and she is building a power sector model of Nigeria. But as this question kind of highlights, what she's looking at is not only how do you bring energy access to Nigeria, but could the least well functioning grid on the continent, the so-called West African power pool, the collective system across West Africa, could Nigeria go from kind of the, I don't want to say it quite this way because my family is Yoruba, West African, the least well-functioning politically or otherwise part of the grid to actually a hub. And we're trying to build that out in partnership with some really impressive non-governmental groups, one based in Senegal, one based in Nigeria, and our contacts in the Ministry of Finance in Nigeria. So absolutely, I would love it. Lots of really, really big challenges there, and ones where the social science balance is particularly critical.
Great. I have one question that I definitely want to get to. It's this: your lab straddles technical research, public policy, and more recently social science leanings. What specific skills do you look for in new candidates?
I usually run over to people like Meg and David and ask their thoughts and opinions around people, because I am much more interested in people who are curious and demonstrate that than any kind of set background.
Great. All right. So I think we should probably just move on to my next broad topic. There are also a couple of questions that don't really fit into any bucket. If we have time at the end, we might try to get to some of them. But I think I'll move on to my next broad question. And that is whether you can, so we talked specifically about sort of your research and how students can participate, but I'm just sort of, it's a very broad question. What excites you most about ERG? Is there sort of something specific about us as a unit, as a group, that makes you specifically happy to come here? And don't worry, I'm not going to ask the dual of that question, what you hate about ERG, because that's just for us. Meg, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, in my amazing 6-week tenure here on campus, I mean, I think what really comes through about ERG is what a community this department is. It's amazing. And also the central role that students play in creating what that culture looks like. And I see students like driving forward all of these different initiatives to create changes in the department for things that they want. And there's a lot of faculty support and administrative support for students as they're trying to do that. So it's really a department that recruits really diverse students and then allows those students to really build the kind of experience both academically and culturally that they want and need. And so that's really what excites me. And I mean, David wears many hats, but he's also our social coordinator, which you may not know. And so that means there's ERG teas, there's happy hours, there's a PhD seminar where students share their work, which is really unique for PhD students to have a weekly seminar where faculty and students are giving you feedback. There's just a whole bunch of different things going on in the ERG community that make this a really intellectually vibrant and friendly and fun place.
Cool.
So I have to ask a follow-up question to both Meg and David. So I'm grabbing the mic as the chair for a second. And that is, what made you pick coming to ERG over the other places that you were looking at, in the sense of, you guys both had lots of really cool choices, but is just Meg's answer, is that the one that kind of resonates, or is there more? Why pick what is sort of a harder story to tell, in the sense, if you go to a traditional department, you don't have much, it's not complicated to explain where you were. Why did you guys take this route? Meg, do you want to start? I need to, dig in my memory. Why?
It's a bit fresher for me.
Yes.
That's a fantastic question. I mean, this is a really exciting place because of its interdisciplinarity. I wanted to be somewhere where I had colleagues who were thinking about similar pressing socio-environmental questions, but from really different perspectives. And I really sensed that this was a place that was incredibly collegial. This was a place that really respected different intellectual perspectives. This was a place that people really thrived. And so that's really what drew me here, was wanting to be part of that, and to be among really diverse colleagues. That's great for some of us who had different disciplinary trainings. It's really refreshing to be with people who bring such different ideas to the table.
Okay, so as far as I remember, because this is a while ago, I think there were really, so I think the thing that really drew me to ERG when I should say, when I made the decision to come to ERG, in that year, I didn't apply anywhere else. It was just a decision whether I would stay in my previous job or would move to ERG. And I think the thing that during the visits that I had here on campus that just blew me away were the students. I just have never, ever, anywhere experienced such a fun, high caliber, but at the same time, like not nose high, but sort of just intellectually curious group of people as our student body. And when I was here, I did sense that the community was good in ERG, but I don't think I got even like half of how good it is during those 2 days when you try to become a faculty, you talk with a lot of people. But to really, I mean, that's sort of the thing that I like most now, but I think that is the real depth of that I really only realized when I came here and then experienced it sort of day to day. It was really the students. I talked with a lot of students when I visited here, and I was just like, what's going on here? They're all smarter than I am. So that I think really drew me here.
Yeah, I always like to say, so I'm, unlike David and Meg, I came here with tenure from Princeton. So kind of a different situation, but even at that stage, I felt intimidated in my first seminars here and teaching my first classes. Not that you need as an applicant to come in and sort of be polished final. I mean, the idea of grad school is that you're coming to learn things. You know there's things you don't know. You have all kinds of different insecurities. But I really felt like this was a place where everyone in the community, from staff to students to faculty, really were colleagues, and we were in it together. And if there's a slide bar between basic research and activism, people were different places, but nobody was pinned either end. All of the ERGs, we call ERGs, all of us, faculty, staff, and students, were somewhere in that slide bar. And that was really refreshing to me. And I just felt like this was a place where whatever I want to work on, someone's going to really challenge me in ways that I might not want at the moment, but I know I'm going to feel better about having to deal with later on.
Great. All right. So as you can see, we're all excited to be in ERG. I think it's a special place. I think one secret to that is that we're so small, and we get along, right? So I guess a small group with conflict is a bad thing, because then you cannot just avoid someone. But a small group that is well functioning and integrated and friends with each other is a wonderful environment to work with. My next question, I want to sort of change gear a little bit. It covers an area that where we've got a lot of questions, and that is what do ERGs do after ERG? So one thing I can just say right away, you never stop being an ERGie. You're an ERGie for life, but you do have to leave this place at some point and do something else. And I thought one fun aspect here would be if I just ask individual faculty, because they know best what their students have been, to what paths they have been going on. I know this is a little bit unfair to Meg at some level, because clearly she has not graduated an ERG student in the 6 weeks that she's been here. But I do think she's worked with students before, and maybe you also have some thoughts, where you want to send people after ERG. So why don't we start with you, Meg, and then move on to Dan.
Yes, I already have your professional futures all mapped out for my hypothetical students now. Really, I think ERG, you will find people have really diverse pathways in terms of what they do next. And that reflects the amazing and diverse students that are in this department. In terms of the students I have worked, I did mention that some of my students have gone on to be practitioners in both development agencies and in other NGO settings. I've also had students who have chosen to go on and do academic positions as well. And here at ERG, I would be really excited about supporting students who are interested in one or the other, or a whole sliding scale, or a mix of both, or don't know. I think part of being a student is doing the discerning of thinking about what your professional paths are, what your calling is, and also how can, we've all worn different hats between being practitioners and academics. And so I think that you'll find that regardless of kind of what your hope is, or maybe you don't even know where you're exactly going to go, that there's a lot of space and support here for having conversations about how we can prepare you for that next step. And so my students, I hope, will find that support in me.
Great. And I think one thing that you actually brought up is maybe also worth mentioning. A lot of ERG faculty do not have straight academic careers. So a lot of us have sort of windy roads with stints outside of academia, and I think that sort of is a factor that probably helps us, advise people with careers that are not in academia as well. But let's go to Dan. So I don't know how we'll do this with Dan, because Dan has, I don't know how many hundreds of students have worked with Dan. So I'll just let you figure out some way to give a useful overview of what some ERGs have done after ERG that have worked with you.
Well, that's what's so much fun. I mean, I have students who have gone on to be faculty, University of Wisconsin, Yale, Imperial College of Science and Technology, Kenyatta University, Kwame Nkrumah University, University of Malaysia, all kinds of places. But I also have students who have gone to found their own NGOs, who have gone on to be the President Obama's climate advisor, people who have gone into federal service in other countries. And I think what's most interesting is that some people arrive quite sure they're not going to be academics. Others coming in, they're sure they're going to be academics. And they almost never end up there. They end up in interesting places, different than what they thought. And so I try to make sure we keep all of those pathways open by doing the right mix among PhD students of teaching and practical work, and writing papers, so that whichever career path they decide they want, they're prepared for it. But it's a really nice thing when, I literally have a student who came in having done an undergraduate peace and conflict studies, and he got a undergraduate degree in physics while a master's student at ERG. He's now a professor of electrical engineering, and I had the kind of the most hardcore nuclear engineer leave here after her master's, and is now running a human rights NGO. And I just feel like that complete spaghetti diagram mixing is like the most exciting aspect of ERG.
Yeah, great. And that is sort of maybe one another interesting aspect. There are some academic departments that if you do a PhD and you don't become an academic, they are not happy. And I think that for us, that is not the case at all. We really want to have an impact on the world as a department, and any path that does that, we think is fantastic. So there's really no, we do, those PhD students of ours that pursue academic careers do really well in that. But someone who pursues another path, we are at least as interested in those folks as sort of the purely academic outlook. So thank you for those thoughts. I'm just looking at the chat, and there's coming so much in that I'm wondering how we best handle that right now. I had one more section, and I am going to ask you that, and then we can sort of spend a little bit time with the chat maybe. And that is, my final round for the two of you is whether you just have any other sort of advice for prospective students. Right now they're sitting at home and they're wondering, what should I put into my application? How can I create an application that is as competitive as I can make it? And so I'll just do one round with both of you with sort of your top level advice for that. And we'll start with Meg again.
I think we've touched on this, but really ERG is looking for whole people who have really diverse trajectories and interests. And so as much as you can narrate your trajectory for us and how that sort of coalesces around sort of big ideas and big questions and big sort of approaches, that's what we're really interested in. It's not about having a crystal clear, single detailed research question. It's about who you are and what you bring to the table, because we really like to have students who bring really diverse perspectives in multiple areas of their lives. And so I would really encourage students to write their application in a way that reflects their diversity of experiences and interests. And that's going to, for us as readers, be really exciting.
Yeah, very good. Dan?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's corny, but I think that, being genuine is the best thing. You don't have to say, I know today I'm going to be the world's best environmental economist or material scientist or whatever else. You have to say, I'm genuinely curious, and here are the experiences that led me to ERG. And I recognize that it is a wonderful, but a non-traditional way to do your degree. And I'm looking for people who that resonates with something they've done or something they express they want to do, because this is really a wonderful place, not only to find yourself, but to find your people. And none of us can navigate this world alone. None of us can navigate the hard questions of sustainability alone. None of us can deal with like the disappointment of watching heads of state or non-heads of state or certain academic communities get in the way of progress. And so you need that network. And we like to say that the Rolodex that will stay with you. I know Rolodex is a very dated term now, but your contact list on your smartphone or your not so smartphone or your abacus or whatever else, that the ERG community, ERGies, that's your resource, whether you're in grad school or 40 years out of grad school.
Yeah, and we have an amazing alumni network that's probably also worth mentioning. We revived that a couple of years ago, and it's very active right now. So they put events on for current students. They liaison with current students. So if you come to ERG, then actually our alumni network is an amazing resource for students as well. And yeah, so I'll say one sentence about this as well. I think one thing that I really encourage people to keep in mind is that because we spent such a ridiculous amount of time in our admissions process, so I see our admissions process as hunting for treasure rather than sort of getting rid of half the pile in the first round, right? So our primary objective is we're most worried that we miss an amazing application that might not look amazing at first sight. And so we spent really, I think I've never seen an admissions process that spent so much time sort of hunting for treasure in our pile of admissions. And I think that's an opportunity for those of you who might have slightly less traditional paths. I mean, you know, if you have a standard, traditional, good-looking CV, you will also be very competitive for us. But don't be shy about applying to ERG if at first glance maybe your history does not look in a traditional way impressive, because maybe it's in a different way impressive. And we really spend a lot of time trying to find any type of excellence in our applications. Okay, so I think what we'll do now is we'll give up on all structure. It's very difficult for me.
Now we're in my world.
And we will just look at the chat and see what kind of questions we have, and we'll go until 4:30. And then we'll stop. So that's the plan here. So one question we got, this is another question we got beforehand, was, could I mention more than one ERG faculty member or ERG affiliate whom I would like to work in my application and statement of purpose? And I think I'll just answer this, yes. We love it if students want to work with multiple faculty. That's often what brings faculty together, what pulls in ERG faculty from our affiliate network. So that is a short answer here.
And just to say, our affiliate network, we have around 11 faculty in the core who sit together collectively. And but then we have over 100 scattered across campus, across the local national lab, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, across a few affiliate organizations in the area. And so I actually encourage people who don't even mention any individual faculty, because you will likely discover neat connections when you get here.
Yeah. All right, then I have a question here. I am an employee of RMI with a communications journalism background, now looking to learn research skills at ERG. Can you talk about the ERG experience differentiation for MA versus MS students? We briefly talked about this last stream already. Maybe Dan, do you want to say something about this?
So first, RMI is the Rocky Mountain Institute. It's something that Amory Lovins founded, kind of one of the gurus of energy efficiency. And in my opinion, there is zero difference between MA and MS. If you feel strategically for some job thing, that's fine. I think it's never made one iota of difference in any way. It just kind of differentiates. Basically, there's one course you take one way or the other. Some people who come in very arts, humanities, decide they get the MS to diversify. I just don't think this is one thing that does not matter.
Yeah, that's exactly what we said last week. Roll a dice for the application, doesn't matter. You can switch it once you're here. Yeah, so that is not an important differentiation. All right, so then here's a good question. What expectations or differences do you expect when selecting prospective students applying for master or PhD students? And I'll let either one of you start responding to that.
Meg?
Well, I'm new to this process, so I would encourage you to listen more to the folks who have had more cycles of looking at students. But I think to Dan's point, there's not a real kind of strict differentiation between master's and PhD in terms of background. I think it's more about kind of where you see yourself and what you want your path to be. So, if you are like, I want to be in the academy, or I think I want an academic position, then the PhD is going to be kind of your pathway there. But that being said, people who do the PhD don't necessarily need to be going to academia. So masters, I often think, are great for exploratory years where you're like deciding what your questions are. You're getting exposed to different methodologies, different faculty, different theories, approaches. And then always after the master's, you can decide if you want to apply for the PhD program here or elsewhere. So I think for those who perhaps are still contemplating if the PhD is right for them, the master's is a really great place for you to have space to do a small project, to get your bearing, and then to make that decision about what comes next. And feel free to contradict me, David and Dan, if you disagree.
Nope.
Don't disagree. And the one thing I would add is that the master's is not specifically a stepping stone to the PhD. It is specifically its own really valuable thing. And people come to it for just tons of different reasons. And I think that's actually really healthy. And so we put together a class that's diverse, not only in terms of people's interests of what they want to get in school, but also what they're saying they're interested afterwards, so that we get differing perspectives on all of these kinds of issues. This is not a place that weeds out people for the PhD based on the master's. They're really different animals.
Yeah, very good. All right, let's move on to the next question, and that's actually also an excellent question. How do you approach your roles as mentors in terms of student interactions, being hands-off versus hands-on? How does the advising role differ from traditional programs? And we'll start with Meg and then move to Dan.
Yeah, so I think, students have really different needs in terms of mentorship. And so I think for me, particularly as an early career mentor, I'm really interested in sort of having conversations early on about expectations for mentors and mentees and seeing what the different needs are. And students have really different needs at different stages. So if someone's working directly on a project that, I have funded, that I'm kind of running, that's going to be a much more sort of like side-by-side collaboration versus students who have their own project where we're meeting on a regular basis, but really they're sort of championing that project and I'm learning from them through that process. And so it really depends on the needs and sort of the vision and the particular interest of a student. I also really think that something that we have in ERG is sort of these lab groups where it's not just about your relationship with the advisor, but it's also about the way that you learn from other graduate students with similar interests. And for me in my graduate career, my greatest ride or die readers of applications, of grants, were my peers. And so these lab groups, I think, are also really important for you to have an intellectual community and also to kind of manage up with your advisor and let them know what you need at different stages. And so I think that really depends on the student and on the advisor, but that's, for me as an advisor, something I like to really have on the table in early conversations. And as David mentioned, particularly for those of us who don't have a lot of students, we probably do have some more bandwidth for working with students. We're on campus. So yeah, I think that it just really depends on what your needs are and thinking through that and communicating that.
Right. Dan?
Yeah, I think it's a tricky one for some of the reasons that Meg said, in the sense that not everyone needs or wants the same thing. And often, grad school is new to you, the student, so you might not know what you need. And so we try to do that through like a mixture of things. There's definitely advisor-student one-on-one time. There's also student-student one-on-one or one-on-n time. And then there's also this kind of mix. So these lab groups, and lab group doesn't mean it's a science thing where everyone's in a lab coat. It really means just an affinity group around different topics, are really valuable to kind of figure those things out. And because ERG has this absolutely remarkable set of graduates, alumni, we call it ERGAN, the ERG Alumni Network. We frequently bring them in. People go to work with them. There's lots of ways to get mentoring. The one thing that I do find consistent, doesn't mean you enter with this confidence, but the thing that I think everyone gets in ERG is that people's paths are different and skill sets are not fully formed. And so you should feel free to ask questions that in some very traditional departments might be seen as kind of naive or like you haven't really thought through the issues. That doesn't mean you get to do less homework when you're in ERG, but what it means is that we encourage people to learn in adaptive ways, and advising is certainly part of that.
Okay, great. Let's see. Let's use this question next. I'm a prospective MPP ERG student interested in energy policy, but considering applying for government jobs now. What can a future policymaker learn from ERG that's harder to get from work experience?
Oh boy, so I'm a faculty member in ERG and in the Goldman School, and you heard before, I've served several governors of California, I've served President Obama, I worked very closely with the Biden administration. I served in the Clinton administration. So I feel like this is an area where I've got some experience, but that experience is not going to be a distillable lesson, unfortunately. It is really diverse. As a physicist, I often get asked for what are the technical or hard skills that are really useful. And I think there is a set. They tend to boil down to, can you do certain kinds of calculations or frame problems in a way that brings clarity? But as we've moved out of the phase in the universe where renewable energy was superior in some moral sense, but inferior in some economic sense, to a world where renewables are, in my completely biased view, superior in the both technical, moral, and economic sense, the world has changed. And so we're thinking about very different aspects. So I have a project in conjunction with partners at the University of Tokyo and at the University of Myanmar. And that's around the role of energy in public policy for peace building. That is not even a real field in a lot of places, but it's one where the nuggets of the ERG training, I definitely feel, give you an advantage over people who have gone through just a Master's of Public Policy or just a technical program. And so I find going through the joint ERG MPP, Master's of Public Policy program, or the joint ERG Law program, or the soon to be in existence joint program with the business school. These are really valuable ways to distinguish yourself, not because the credential, but because you genuinely know how people in these different sub-communities think, and you might love it, you might ridicule it, but you have some understanding of it, which is more than kind of a knee-jerk reaction.
Great. Meg, do you want to say something about this as well?
Oh, I think that was fantastic. No, okay. We'll leave it there.
Yeah. I think I actually, so one way I've thought about this in the past is that I think ERG students come out of this program with an incredible intellectual rigor on one hand, so they can sort of go deep on the technical side or the methodological side, and you can get that in other degrees as well, right? So if you go to a very narrow degree, you come out typically technically really sound, but ERG students at the same time can sort of take that step back really quickly and sort of see how that is framed in broader questions. And I've worked a lot in sort of with governmental advice and so on, and it's those people that really are needed in positions of decision making that can, on one hand, detect nonsense and non-rigorous and wrong things, and you need to really be able to dig deep in for that, and at the same time not lose sight of the big picture. And I think ERGs are really incredibly well equipped for those kinds of gigs, at least what I've seen since I've been here. All right, so let's see, how are we doing on time? Next question here. I think this we can do really quickly. We were informed last session that most PhD students are also research assistants or teach certain subjects. What subjects do you allow your PhD candidates to teach?
We've never constrained it.
We've never constrained it. As long as you can convince the professor who's teaching a class that you can do the teaching, then from ERG's point of view, fantastic, right? There are really no constraints. Let's see. Here we have one for Meg. Professor Mills-Novoa, what drew you to focus your studies on the Americas in particular?
Thanks for that question. Yeah, I mean, I also did work in Southeast Asia previous to starting graduate school, and yeah, have worked in different parts of the Americas. I mean, I think a lot of this, I'm Cuban American, and so for me, working in Latin America is also, for me, part of sort of my family story and heritage. And so I started working in Latin America partially because I just loved it. I thought this was just such an important place to ask questions. There's so many pressing socio-environmental questions going on, and also just loved sort of the cultural atmosphere and the way that it connected also with me growing up in a mixed family. And also in sort of shifting to also think about working in the United States, that's also about wanting to do work in the places that we live and really wanting to have both that perspective of working where we are and also thinking more broadly. And so, yeah, working across the Americas for me has been really sort of like an act of just like love and interest. And I think also saying that, one thing that I think I see a lot among students and other ERG faculty, and I definitely think of, is that we're really curious people. So I also don't want students to think that if they're not, interested in working specifically in Latin America or in the Western United States, that somehow I won't be interested in their work. I think we're all really curious about things going on all over the world. So for me, that's how I arrived on the places that I do my work. And I'm also interested in supporting students who, have different callings.
So Meg, I'm actually really glad you brought this last point up because I think probably one risk with doing these live streams where faculty talk about the things that they work on is that we now will get lots of applications that are specifically tailored to those topics. And one advice I want to give to people: don't do that. We actually, because I think one of the real joys of being a faculty at ERG, and I think also what sort of keeps the intellectual community alive here, is that we faculty are being drawn away from our core topics that we work on right now by students all the time. And I actually don't want to lose that. I don't want to end up in a situation where people write applications specifically, to the research interests of specific faculty. If that's a match, fantastic, highlight it. But I what Meg just said, we love to get people that want to work on things where some faculty is drawn by the student into a new topic. So that, I think, is actually a really important point here. And Meg, I have another question for you. So let's just stay with you here. Professor Mills-Novoa, do you have plans to expand your research focus out of the Americas, particularly in South Asia?
Yes, through amazing students who are excited about asking those questions. Yes, at this point, my core projects are still focused on the Americas, but I'm really excited in supporting students who are asking those questions. And I think through those collaborations, we can start to think about grants and other ways that we can leverage resources, bring in colleagues of mine who do work in those areas and other people on campus to ask those questions. So I certainly don't feel limited to just working in the Americas. And I'm really excited to have my research program grow with the students who come into ERG and also into ESPM, where I'm jointly appointed.
Great, fantastic. So I'm going to take one last question, and I'm just going to take one that I can answer. This is the power of being in control here. And that was, I wonder why the GRE is the requirement to apply to ERG, since most of the universities ask for it. And others can chime in as well, but we spent an enormous amount of time last year discussing should we use the GRE or not. In the end, we decided there's a lot of research that actually shows that the GRE is a terrible predictor of academic success. So first of all, it's just not a very useful indicator whether someone will do well in grad school or not. And it also, in many ways, undermined our idea of hunting for treasures to have this one indicator. It's well studied that people that have gone through to rich Ivy League universities do better on standardized tests like that, but they might not necessarily, people who haven't had this path might actually be equally good academics, and that might not show up in the GRE. So we just felt it did not jive with our ideas of equity and diversity and and it also doesn't even do what it, pretends to do, be a predictor of academic success. So we decided to just do away with it. It's actually, I think there are only very few departments on campus here in Berkeley left that actually require the GRE. I think this has certainly been a trend across campus here. I don't know whether Meg or Dan, whether either of you want to chime in on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think what the GRE predicts, it most accurately predicts your individual wealth.
Yeah, and that's not at all.
It's not a criteria we value.
Yes.
My only comment would be good riddance as a GRE survivor.
Yes, good.
Terrible.
All right. So I think if we configured everything properly, you cannot even submit the GRE. We're not using it in our admissions process anymore. Last year was the first year that we already did not use it at all. We made a mistake last year. We actually made it optional, the GRE, in the application. So some people submitted it, some didn't. We then realized that's actually really unfair. And so in the actual process, we never looked at it at all. So the cohort that we admitted last year was already a cohort where we didn't take that into consideration at all. And I can tell you the people that showed up here in September on campus were fantastic. So our 1-year experiment with not using the GRE, I would call a great success. Yeah. All right. So I think we're really at the end of our time. I want to just, either Meg or Dan, is there something final that you want to say before? But it has to be short now, because now my German desire to end on time is getting very strong.
I'll just say that this is my first year where I'll get to read files of students, and I'm so excited to get to know the students who are applying. I think it's going to be, it's just going to be a real treat. So I'm excited to see your applications.
Great. Dan?
I'm good.
All right. Okay, so I think then that really concludes our second live stream for prospective students. Thank you everyone who joined us. Thanks for all the fantastic questions. There are still questions here that we didn't get to. We're going to save those, and we'll try to find some way to respond to those. The only other thing that I want to say, please tune in again in 2 weeks, where we have Duncan Calloway, Lara Kippers, and Isha Ray, 3 other faculty here in ERG, as our guests. And then you can ask them about their research and questions and their perspectives. I hope these live streams are useful for you. Please leave feedback for us and tell us whether this helps you make a decision whether to apply to ERG or not. And I hope to see many of you in 2 weeks. And with that, bye-bye and have a good weekend.